Hello, and welcome to today's Environment and Energy Leader webinar titled Gather Around: How to Optimize Waste and Chemical Management and Embrace a Circular Economy, sponsored by Cority. My name is Jessica Hunt, and I am the Director of Live Events for E&E Leader. Before I hand the presentation over to our speaker, I do want to go over a few housekeeping items with attendees. I am going to apologize in advance if you hear either of my dogs barking during today's event. First and foremost, thank you for being on with us wherever you are in the world today. In case you are unable to join us live, this event will be available on demand by Wednesday evening. If you are having technical issues, please troubleshoot first using the help widget at the bottom of your screen. If you are still having issues after performing those steps, please feel free to give me a message in the Q&A widget. We will have time for a few questions at the end of today's webinar. Please submit over the next 40 to 45 minutes or so. And in case you do not have your question answered during the live event, a member of Cority's team will follow up with you as soon as possible. I'd like to give a warm welcome to today's speaker. Welcome back to Krystal Truax. She is the Senior Product Manager for Environmental at Cority. And at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to her, and I will rejoin everybody for the Q&A.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. And I also want to echo the warning about the dogs, because I have a 6-month-old puppy who's taking a little snooze in my office with me right now. I don't anticipate you will hear from him because well, you might hear some snoring, but if you do, I apologize in advance. So let's get started. Today we're talking about how to optimize waste management and embrace a circular economy. And again, I'm Krystal Truax. I'm the Director of Product here at Cority for our environmental and sustainability clouds. So let's just get started. Let's jump right into this presentation. So nice to meet you. I always love doing these webinars. Happy to be here, happy to talk about this topic. And since I've already kind of introduced myself, we'll kind of just go through this slide. All right, so let's talk about our learning objectives. What do we get out of this session today? The first thing we're going to talk about is the benefits of a circular economy and a circular economic model. We're also going to talk about the challenges of transitioning from the linear economy that we're in now to a more circular economy. And then we're going to talk about how chemical and waste management are really key components of circularity as they pertain to the resources coming in and the products going out. And then we're going to talk about how to utilize digital solutions and the value that they bring when we're trying to empower, circularity into our processes and embed that in how we do business. Okay, so let's talk about a circular economy. When I think of a circular economy, I immediately think of waste management and what that means in this new economic model. So waste management, it's no longer an exercise in management after the fact. It's really the avoidance of that end of life, or that grave in the cradle to grave life cycle that we see in waste management. It's really more of a cradle to cradle approach now. And that's an exercise that starts with procurement, and it would ultimately end in the reuse of your products rather than the management of waste. So what is a circular economy? I know we've thrown that term around a few times now and haven't properly introduced it. So simply put, a circular economy is one where our consumption of resources and materials is circular rather than linear. So if you look at the presentation, we have what a linear model looks like. It's that take, make, and dispose. So in a circular economy, we don't source from raw materials if it can be helped. Rather, we reuse our resources. That's the emphasis. And the goal is to put resources and materials back into the economy rather than throwing them away. So there really is, there is a final destination, but it is significantly less than what you'd have in a take, make, dispose linear economy. In a circular economy, energy and resources they're really valued, like gold. And in a linear economy with that take, make, dispose step-by-step plan, it really means that the raw materials, they're collected, then transformed into products, and then they're used until they're finally discarded as waste. Values created in this economic system by producing and selling as many products as possible. So the more products that can't be reused, the more waste you have. I always think of this example when I think about like this take, make, dispose economy. My grandmother had this refrigerator that still runs. She passed away several years ago, but this refrigerator is still going strong. And they say like, no, they don't make them like they used to. And it's so true. We are an economy centered around, what can we use for 3 to 5 years and then get a new version of? And, that's just, it's not sustainable. And it's, unfortunately, forcing us to kind of look at this other model of circularity and how do we keep things in the value chain. So I put this slide up to just kind of show some different supply chains that we have, where we have traditional, where we source, which is the take, make, dispose linear economic model. This follows the traditional from your suppliers. You have sustainable, where there's a small like repair component and a larger recycling component than the take, make, dispose. And then there's the circular economy, where you have multiple levels in your supply, where you ultimately would get to like that zero landfill, but you have repairing, you have reuse, you have refurbishment, and then recycling, all of these different avenues to put that product back in its new life cycle, for example. So I just wanted to show this because it's a good visual of how traditional versus sustainable versus circular supply chains and economies kind of look. Okay, so let's talk about, on a large scale, global economies that are embracing circularity. So the term circular economy, it's really been around, I would say, probably since 2009, even though we're seeing a ton of momentum, and it's almost a buzzword or buzz phrase now, circular economy. We still have a really long way to go. We're seeing several countries, they're starting to shift their thinking and even their regulatory frameworks, but it's a really slow process. There's places in Europe that have been, throwing this concept, even though it wasn't really named circular economy, but the concept of what the circular economy is trying to do since the 80s, and it's still a work in progress. So again, it's a slow process, but it's one that's seeing a lot of interest and a lot of movement, and like I said, a lot of momentum. And so the Green New Deal in Europe is probably the best example of a country or a group of countries taking charge on this front. And it's basically Europe's action plan to promote the efficient use of resources by really moving to, as much as they can, a circular economy. So it's called the Circular Economy Action Plan, and it consists of 2 plans. One actually dates back to 2015, and the other one in 2020 addresses like key product value chains for like electronics and batteries and vehicles and packaging and plastics and textiles and foods. It's very all-encompassing. So you see that they've got specific action plans targeted at specific items that typically end up in landfill. How do we reuse this? How do we recycle this? How do we refurbish it? Asking those questions, having a plan of attack there. In the United States, we have it's called a national recycling strategy, and this is part of our EPA strategy to build out a circular economy and focus more so on increasing our recycling rate up to 50%. And the goal there is like by 2030. They have 5 main strategic objectives. The first is to improve markets for recycled commodities. So one of the problems that we have with embracing a circular economic model is our recycling infrastructure is just not ready for the amount of items and variety of items that would have to be recycled in order to make this a reality. So increasing collection and improving materials management infrastructure is a big item that has to happen before we can embrace circularity in any meaningful way. Reduce contamination in recycled materials. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of the challenges here in subsequent slides. Enhancing policies to support recycling. So a lot of the things that are happening are piecemeal. You have cities that have really strict recycling, or municipalities that pick up recycling twice a week, but waste, once a week to try to encourage that recycling. But there's really a lack of a national mandate or national framework for recycling. And also standardize the measurement of the data that they're collecting and increase the data that they're collecting so that we can really benchmark, where are we at and how do we know that we're going to be at 50% by 2030? And that's where digital solutions can, come in and really help with that. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. In Canada, they have a national strategy to encourage the remanufacturing and other value retention processes. Australia, they have a national waste policy, which is doing a lot of similar things to what the US is trying to do. And then we're also seeing in Latin America and the Caribbean coming together to form a circular economy coalition. So everything is, it's happening on a global scale, but some places are further ahead and they're thinking about things differently. And we're just at different places in the process. But the takeaway is that it is happening. It's happening on a global scale. These conversations are being had, and decisions are being made. So let's talk about the benefits of a circular economy. It's intentionally regenerative, right? Where the goal is to improve the performance of the resources that are being used in the process. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development predicts that a circular economy is a $4.5 trillion commercial opportunity. And the components of that opportunity are, reduction in emissions, economic growth, recycling and repairing industries that'll be, necessary for, like I said, the variety and the amount of items that need to be recycled and refurbished and repaired and put back into the production value chain. And then because of that need, there's new businesses, new niches that are going to develop, and innovation that's going to be required for these reuse activities. So there's a lot of opportunity there for, businesses that don't exist yet because they've never had to. Another benefit is just the resource consumption reductions. So some projections put a 70% increase on material savings when you're employing a circular economic model. 70%. I mean, that's huge. And then there's the supply chain component. So a robust supply chain, because a circular economy, it really insulates you from having to source raw materials. So, improve security from end-of-life products it's a no-brainer, right? Another benefit, it's also the foundation of sustainability. We're in this world where ESG and sustainability and carbon footprint, it's all the rage, I guess I'll say. But it's really important to understand that it's not just about planting trees or doing risk assessments. It's about changing how we think and how we do business. And that is really what a circular economy will do. And lastly, I would say that it really drives innovation. So what I was talking about, like these recycling and repairing industries and how, at least in the United States, our recycling capacity is nowhere near where it needs to be to actually make this work. Take innovation and new us to do business that way. But with all the benefits, there's definitely some challenges. You've probably been thinking about some of these in your head as I've been chatting here. Despite the buzz around the term circularity and the ideals of the circular economic model that I just kind of talked about, and all the benefits. As of 2018, the global circular economy progress, as it's measured, actually was only 9.1%. And it actually went down in 2018. So between 2018 and 2020, the number decreased by a small percentage. It went down from 9.1 to 8.6. And these are figures from the Circularity Gap Reporting Initiative. So even though there's this buzz and there's this momentum, we actually decreased between 2018 and 2020. So the challenges, consumer convenience. So moving from what we want to what's available. So if you think about, I live in Michigan and I love orange juice and oranges and citrusy fruits. Well, that's never available naturally here. And so if we're going to shift our thinking, like, people are going to have to give up some of those conveniences that we have in favor of, what is available where you live, and what do you do with that? Other challenges, local regulations. So I kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but a lack of an overall big picture and implementable set of standards on a large scale. We don't have that. Waste management, it wasn't designed with reuse and refurbishment in mind. We have that cradle to grave, not a cradle to cradle approach. Recycling technology, it's not up to the challenge right now. We talked about that kind of a little bit as well. And then business models. Business models that we currently employ were not created based on recycled, repurposed goods that are manufactured, from non or less toxic ingredients. Like that wasn't the standard, and now it's becoming the standard, but we have a long way to go. Kind of bleak. Well, let's move on to some different components of a circular economy. And I want to touch on chemical management, because as it pertains to a circular economy, chemical management is really important. And responsible sourcing of chemicals that go into the products that are created based on their toxicity and reuse potential is really a key element of adopting a circular economy. So really, there's little emphasis that's been given to reducing the losses of chemicals throughout their life cycles, especially during the initial use and the end of life. Plastics are a really good and really sad example, but less than 9% of plastic waste generated gets recycled. 79% gets disposed of in landfills, or worse, it doesn't get disposed at all. It's those plastic bags you see floating around the highways. So there's just not a lot of thought into what we can do when it comes to the chemicals going into the products that we create to advocate for a circular economic model or facilitate it even. So one of the things that we can do is we can expand chemical risk assessments. So making the assessment of overall hazards the primary focus of a chemical risk assessment. So including considerations for how this chemical could not just be used, but reused, and how much of the chemical's value can be retained during that reuse. So some things to focus on are assessing the hazards of disposal, as well as the exposure considerations that are, part of the risk assessment anyway. But considering that the ability to not use the chemical or reuse the chemical as a hazard in itself. So also including considerations for how it could be reused or used as critical criteria for acceptance, and identifying safer alternatives or less toxic alternatives that would increase that reuse option. Like those should all be components of a chemical risk assessment as we're moving towards a circular economy. And waste management. So in addition to, I'll say, responsible chemical management, we need to overhaul our thinking of what waste management is and work to take that waste out of waste management. So in a true circular economy, we kind of talked about this, there's no waste. Waste would be reused, repaired, refurbished, remanufactured, repurposed, recycled, all the re's. And we're nowhere near that ideal, but we should be advancing towards the goal. And one way to do that is to expand a waste management program to look at current waste and start to think about that cradle to cradle instead of that cradle to grave approach. Reduction in what is actually waste is the goal, but we also need to rethink what we're doing with the waste that we have so that we can repurpose it. And if you don't have that big picture, or the data that feeds into that big picture, or if it's segmented across several different spreadsheets or different organizations, it's really hard to tell where you're starting and how to get where you need to go. And that's where digital solutions comes in. So now that I've given a background on, what circularity is and all the good things and all the challenges and the different components that we can focus on to progress towards the goal, I want to talk about digital solutions and the challenges and the role that digital solutions play in achieving circularity. So I'm going to introduce you to some digital tools that will empower your journey towards circularity from procurement all the way through the disposal, or ideally the reuse, recyclability analysis of the would-be waste. First thing I want to talk about is supplier management. So a circular economy starts with the sourcing of your materials, and understanding of your suppliers and how they fit and comply with your goals for circularity. And digital solutions can help in really two main ways. So one is the supplier criteria. So identifying the criteria for your suppliers, storing those criteria to be used in your evaluations. Things like, is this circular economically compliant? What kind of a reputation does this supplier have? Do they have eco-friendly packaging? Just a ton of questions that you can be asking or, thinking about as criteria for using this supplier as part of your supply chain. And then there's supplier evaluation. So once you have those criteria, how does this supplier or potential supplier compare to those criteria that you've set out? And not only how do they compare to your criteria, but how do they compare to other suppliers in your network? It's a great evaluation, and it really allows you to, gather the supplier information, think about the life cycle, the relationship you can have with them, how insulated they are from risk, depending on, how much do they source raw materials, things like that you can put into those criteria and have somewhere to house all of those things, and then do a comparative analysis against those criteria, against the supplier, and then supplier versus supplier even, to give you more insights. Chemical management. So there's a few solutions that a few essentials that a digital solution should provide for chemical management that would advance your circularity goals. So the first is having a safety data sheet library, so an SDS library, and access to all the regulatory information. That's really critical, and that helps to understand, what's in the products, how safe are they, and what regulations relate to them. And in addition to an SDS library and access to the regulatory information, it's really important for a digital solution to provide chemical approvals. So earlier in the presentation, I talked about improving your chemical risk assessment to take action into consideration of the overall, hazards of a chemical before it's approved for addition into your inventory. A strong chemical approvals process allows for local and corporate approvers that can really review a request for a new chemical and take into consideration things like not only the safety and environmental considerations, but overall circularity considerations, like, is there a safer and less toxic option? What's the reuse potential for this product? And that's one of the really powerful things that a digital solution, can do. And now we're going to come back to risk assessments. So digital solutions, they can provide a risk registry. Cority has a risk registry of risks associated to your business, like the risks associated with a particular waste profile or a chemical being procured and the suppliers being used. Earlier, and even the last slide, I talked about expanding the risk assessments for chemicals to include things like how the chemical could be used, and not just used, but reused, and how much of that chemical's value can be retained during the reuse. So some things to focus on are assessing the hazards of disposal, as well as the exposure and the considerations, not just about like the hazards, but being able to reuse the chemical and not being able to reuse it, considering that as a hazard itself. So in a risk assessment, you can include considerations for how it could be used and reused as a hazard, identifying safer alternatives, all part of that assessment. So another digital solution, another digital tool is an advanced risk assessment tool that allows you to have a registry of all these risks associated to the suppliers that you're using, the chemical procured, and what the waste would eventually look like. And then there's waste tracking. So the title of this presentation, is Gather Around, and we're talking about waste in a circular economy. And in a circular economy, there is no waste. The exercise in waste management is an exercise in zero waste, right? A waste management solution, a digital solution specifically, is something that can help you track your waste, and it'll help you to track and benchmark, what and who is treating your waste, how it's being disposed of, what were you able to recycle, what were you able to divert from disposal or reuse, either in your own processes or somewhere else. These are all key components to, a digital. It's the treatment, the disposal, the recycling, the reuse, and not only for one organization, but across many organizations, and being able to see how, one location is doing versus another location, and goal projections on, waste reduction. Like, these are all things that a digital tool empowers you, to have the knowledge of, so you can make better decisions as you progress towards your goal of circularity. So there's a great example of one of Cority's clients, a large retailer, that uses our waste management solution. And they found that once they started tracking their waste, their disposal, they found that they were just sending all of these tires from their fleet, all of these tires, to a landfill for disposal. And it was a pretty sizable sum that they had to pay to dispose of these tires from their fleet. And what they found was that instead of disposing them at a landfill, they could actually send these to another company to be shredded and used in playground mulch. So a digital solution helped this large retailer, one, identify what it is that they were disposing, how much they were disposing, and reuse opportunities. So it took a negative line item, something that was costing them money, costing them a lot of money, into a revenue stream where they could then sell these tires, divert them from the landfill, and give them a new, lease on life, if you will, as mulch for a playground. So that's a really good story of a reuse opportunity that was identified using a digital solution. So let's talk about objective tracking and goal projections. I kind of slipped into this in an earlier slide, but when it comes to a circular economy, progress is really the goal, not perfection, because we don't have the infrastructure for perfection. But there's a lot of, there's several hurdles to overcome in order to really fully embrace a circular economy. And Cority, our waste solution, actually, allows users, not just our waste solution, our Cority solution allows users to set objectives related to your chemical and waste management approaches, as you move towards facilitating greater circularity. For example, maybe you have an objective to reduce or phase out the use of a particular chemical by 2030, and you want to divert 50% of your waste from landfills by 2025. Like, maybe those are your goals. You can actually set up those objectives and track your progress against those goals that you've set. And you can go further with our core analytics tool by forecasting whether or not you're on track to meet your objectives based on your historical performance and your projected future performance. And you can use scenario modeling to see how you've performed, or your performance would change based on these variables. And it allows you to do things like increasing your waste recovery rates, your diversion rates, phase out certain products, or setting corporate limits on certain chemical use, because you have access to information that will tell that story in a visual, pleasant way. And I think that another key takeaway for digital solutions, and really the power of the digital solution is the confidence that it gives you to make decisions, to report on your performance. It gives you the ability to make data-driven decisions. It gives you the ability to look at what you have, where you are, understand where you're at, and then where you need to go, and whether it will get you there. And then when you do get there, it gives you very solid ground to stand on, very auditable ground to stand on when you report out publicly the incredible gains that you've made. So confidence is probably the biggest value add of a digital solution. So for internal stakeholders, for external stakeholders, confidence, auditability are great components of having a digital solution. Even though I always trust my gut feeling, I like to have data to back up decisions as well. So let's recap on what we just talked about. I want to save some time for questions. Circularity is already happening. We are already moving towards a circular economic model. I don't know if we're ever going to fully get there. There's going to have to be pretty dramatic changes to, how consumers, what consumers' expectations are, and the reality of what a circular economy would mean for consumers. There's infrastructure for recycling that is very far behind what is actually needed. But it's happening. We're moving the needle. We're headed in that direction. There's a lot of benefits to circularity. Natural resource consumption it's alarming how much we have to extract, to maintain, how our business models are business models that we currently have. If I think that the pandemic, taught us anything about supply chain issues, and not having the ability to get things, it really, kind of showed that circularity has a lot of benefits, especially if you can have that insulation in your supply chain and make it more robust. It gives a lot of pathways for innovation. So there's a lot of industries that don't yet exist because they never have had to exist before, but that will, be necessary to facilitate all of the reuse, repair, recycling that will have to happen if we're truly going to embrace a circular economy. Challenges, so many challenges. I kind of slipped into the challenges when I was talking about how circularity is already happening. We need more of a recycling infrastructure. We need consumers to think about things in a different way. We need new business models. We need standards. We need goals to measure against, and a unified approach. And those are things that are going to, I think, be difficult, but not impossible to come by, but maybe piecemeal. And waste management. So these are the key components of circularity. As I understand it, as I watch, the manufacturing process and the chemicals used, and the need for safer alternatives, less toxic alternatives, so that we can get to that next goal of recyclability and reuse of a chemical. So knowing and understanding, from procurement, what that chemical can do for you, how it can be reused, how much of the value can be retained. Those are big decision points that need to be considered if you're trying to embrace a circular economy. And waste management really should be called waste diversion. I feel like if we're in a circular economy, waste management becomes waste diversion. Like, that's the practice. You're not managing the waste, you're diverting it to be something else and not waste. So again, a different way of thinking about things, a different model that needs to be employed. So we're not thinking about that cradle to grave, but that cradle to cradle. And a big part of waste management becomes, reuse of a product. And then digital tools as an essential component to a circular economy. So there's a lot of examples out there of, manufacturers that need to have this visibility into their supply chain to meet their goals and understand, are they meeting their goals for circularity? And you can't do that efficiently or credibly if you don't have some kind of standard digital solution, a central location for all of your information that has safeguards in place to help mitigate, human errors, or to store your risk registries, to look at your waste activities holistically and your procurement activities holistically, and evaluate your suppliers, and have all of this in one central location so that you can really see the big picture of your whole organization, make data-driven decisions based on that information at a large scale, and be confident in the decisions that you're making because they're auditable as you're, sharing out the good work that you've done. So that's my recap of the presentation. Thank you guys for spending some time with me this afternoon or morning or wherever you're at. I appreciate you guys coming in and listening to this conversation, and I hope that I've left you with some things to ponder about, where do I go next in my search for a digital solution? Or, how do I beef up my risk assessments, and what can I do, to embrace circularity, and how, digital solutions can help. So with that, I will open it up for questions. Again, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Krystal, for a fantastic presentation. We did get quite a few questions from attendees. We will do our best to answer them in the time that we have remaining. And I do want to apologize. I gave you guys the wrong title for Krystal at the beginning of the presentation. She is now the Director of Product for Environmental and Sustainability Cloud at Cority. So sorry about that, Krystal.
No problem.
All right. So let's get started with our Q&A. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how Cority will be supporting the tracking and management of circular economies? I know you touched on this in your presentation, but if you could go into a little bit more detail, that would be great.
Yeah. So, and that's a great question. I highlighted a lot of, the components of a good digital solution, but in particular, Cority, the power behind Cority is that we have the ability to track your supplier relationships all the way through what happens to the end of life of your waste, or how to divert that waste. So what Cority offers is really a one-stop shop for the entire life cycle, the cradle to cradle, if you will. We're trying to get away from the cradle to grave approach, and Cority offers that cradle to cradle, so you can track from the procurement all the way through the reuse of your products,
which is a fantastic feature that you guys have. Let's talk about, the reporting frameworks. And I get this question a lot, pretty much in almost every webinar that we do. There are so many different standards. Do you foresee there being one universal one that's used, or do you think it's really going to depend on, what industry you're in terms of the standards?
So I don't see necessarily a set of standards, a framework around a circular economy that's applicable, globally, because all of these economies are, and microeconomies are going to be very different. And so any kind of standardization will have to come from, processes, from procurement, not using resources or, virgin resources in your production. So I think that there's going to be some frameworks to guide this, but I don't think they're going to be universal. And I don't think that they're going to be, coming anytime soon. And when they do, it'll be more of a piecemeal approach. It's not going to address the entire, circular economy as a whole. But we're seeing things like extended producer responsibility, where the producer is actually charged with the disposal of, the packaging that they put their products in, and more of a complete life cycle approach. So again, I think it's going to be piecemeal, and it's going to be rolled out gradually, different places, different times, much like we see the sustainability and ESG kind of things happening. And Europe is much further ahead in their, circular economic initiatives and requirements. So I think that what we're seeing there will then lend to kind of what we're going to see in North America as well.
Yeah, and I was going to say the webinar that we did last week brought up that too, the differences between where the United States is in the ESG, world, as opposed to, where Europe is with circularity and things. So it's definitely something that is being talked about in the industry, and, we're going to continue to see changes. Can you elaborate now a little bit more on some of the future trends that you see with circular economy?
Yeah, I think that, as I mentioned, globally, we're all kind of headed in that direction, right? There's a much bigger spotlight on procurement and what kind of materials you're using and the suppliers that you're sourcing from, and having that visibility, that transparency into your process. I feel like it's just going to get more stringent. We're all moving in that direction. As far as trends, it's kind of hard to say. We're all at different stages, but I envision definitely more transparency in your operations will be required in the future.
I couldn't agree more with you. With transparency, have you seen any pushback from I don't even want to say like different clients, but it's such a change when people, companies didn't want to share information or, didn't need to disclose it. And now it's a complete shift to being 100% basically transparent with, not just your customers, but the internal stakeholders.
Right. And it extends to your whole supply chain, right? And that's where the circular economy really runs into some of its challenges, because if you are, a producer of beverages, for example, like think about the big beverages, you've got Coca-Cola, you've got Pepsi, think about all of the suppliers that they need to work with to get their product created and then to the market and then sold. And then what happens to those cans? What happens to those bottles, right? I mean, it is a huge process. And you see big companies saying, we're going to go net zero by 2030. Well, that's an awesome goal. And I applaud those goals. But to do that, they have to get all of their suppliers on board. Their suppliers have to get their suppliers on board. And it is a huge undertaking. And so transparency is going to be required to just, not just to see what you're doing, right, as your own organization internally. But if you're going to say you're net zero, or you've reached this level of circularity, or even a sustainable economy, right? To say that, you need to actually validate it. It's not enough to, kind of greenwash what you're doing and say, oh yeah, we're net zero, but you have to actually prove it. So you're going to have that transparency, and that takes time.
Yes. And I mean, the bigger companies, I can't even imagine that undertaking in terms of working with their suppliers and as you said, their suppliers. So it's definitely a big trickle down effect, and data is going to have to be validated in order for them to say and come out and say, our company is net zero.
Right.
Well, we don't really have much more time for questions, but I'm gonna leave the floor to Krystal for a couple minutes just to say, what are the 2 or 3 big takeaways that you want for our attendees today?
Yeah, thanks for asking. We're looking for progress on a circular economy. We don't quite have the infrastructure, especially on a global level, to facilitate a true circular economy. And it's going to take a lot on the consumer end to, continue that push towards circularity. But there's a lot that we can do now. And to facilitate, that progress, those goals, you absolutely do need a digital solution. Because again, to go back to the example of Pepsi or Coke or one of these big, beverage manufacturers, for example, or suppliers, think about all of the spreadsheets you would have to have linked to tell that story of, here we are, here's our suppliers, here's their suppliers, here's their suppliers. And how do you market the good things that you're doing if you can't tell the story? And a digital solution not only gets you from point A to point B, but it gives you an auditable trail of how you got to point B that you can, tell your story with confidence.
And I think that's a great way to wrap it up. I can't imagine having to deal with Excel spreadsheets for even a small company. It just seems like it would be overwhelming. And there are so many ways that, human error too.
All the time. And even with a digital solution, there could be human error, but there's a lot less likelihood, and there's steps in place to mitigate those where you just don't have that otherwise.
Exactly. Well, I do want to thank you again, Krystal, for spending the hour with us today. And I want to thank the attendees who are on live as well as those who are watching on demand. And a big thank you to Cority. We love working with the team and hope to see you guys on with us again soon. So thanks again, Krystal. And at this point, I'm going to conclude today's webinar, and I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon.